Hi everybody, we're going to look at chapter 6, which is all about newspapers and the news. Newspapers first came on the scene during colonial times, and they were mostly weeklies, and they were just stuck together by a printer. There was no staff and no real format for them. When the steam-powered press came about and it was easier to print, dailies became common, and these reported on politics and the economy, but they were too expensive for the everyday guy and distributed by mail. Benjamin Day was the first guy to figure out that there was a mass market for newspapers, and in 1833 he launched The Sun, a penny a copy paper with a focus on stories that interested the everyday Joe, and they were written in plain English. He created a format that caught on quickly, and it was widely successful. And this was the beginning of advertising covering the cost for newspapers. So that cost of a penny only helped with production. The wide audience that it reached enticed advertisers, and so they subsidized the consumer cost by buying ad space, just like how the model is set up now for newspapers and a lot of different media sources. The success of the penny papers was made possible by the Industrial Revolution and the social and economic factors that resulted from that movement of people. Industrialization brought the steam-powered press. Urbanization was just that movement of people into the cities to work in all the new factories, which caused this large group of diverse people to be this audience for the new papers. And immigrants from poor parts of Europe would use the penny papers to learn English because it printed in unpretentious language, and literacy was increasing at the time, and so many people were interested in reading the papers. The success of the penny press format with reporting and editorial staffs, large revenue streams from advertising, led to the structure of newspapers that we have today, which includes a news staff headed up by an editor, a production staff of typesetters and technicians and designers who understand complex machinery and how to assemble that product, an advertising staff who works to sell advertisements to fund the newspaper, and then you have the circulation department, which works on building readership, attracting advertisers, and distributing the paper. And then you have your business staff, which covers bookkeeping, accounting, and lawyers. So the format of the paper was another contribution to the success that it had. Newspapers include news and information and entertainment, along with question columns and short stories and opinion pages and horoscopes and comics, which creates a package that's really accessible to a wide array of readers. And this structure has remained in place for over 160 years and led to a long-running dominance of newspapers and print media. And now it's changing. They're starting to centralize offices and centralize parts of the newspaper to cut down on the cost, since they're struggling in this transition to digital media. So, for instance, the Rapid City Journal is starting to centralize some of their design work and pagination processes to Munster, Iowa. So a whole bunch of newspapers are laid out in one place and then sent to the local communities that they serve. Let's look at the history, starting with the earliest newspapers. So Gutenberg invented movable metal type in the 1450s, which played a huge role in the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s, and then this trend to democratizing information continued. In 1618, a little over 100 years later, the first English language newspaper appeared in Amsterdam. And then by 1622, similar formats of that broadsheet, the Coranto, were appearing in coffee houses throughout Britain. The government tried to censor and control these papers because they were supporting a growing trend in capitalism, which was in direct conflict with the aristocracy, but they were unable to contain them, and the news and information spread. The first newspaper was published in the colonies in 1690 but it was shut down after one issue because of some disparaging remarks about the King of France. The newspaper Public Occurrences reported accusations of incest and immorality among the royal family and criticized the British military for mistreating French prisoners. And this was at a time when colonial newspapers were subject to British censorship. It was illegal to print without permission. And so Benjamin Harris and his Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic, was suppressed, but Harris actually continued to print other documents, even though he could not have his newspaper, which was based out of Boston. In 1721, the New England Courant was started by James Franklin, who was the elder brother of Benjamin Franklin, and the Courant was the first newspaper without explicit approval of the British Crown. And so this lack of approval ended up getting James put in jail for 4 weeks, and it opened the way for 16-year-old Benjamin to take over the publication for that time. He was James's printer's apprentice at the time, and about 8 years later he purchased the Pennsylvania Gazette, and it grew into one of the most influential papers of the time in the colonies. Benjamin Franklin was responsible for printing the first political cartoon in the colonies. The New England Courant was snuffed out by authorities in 1727 because the Franklins were mocking religion and magistrates, and that was the end of the paper. So early newspapers were different from the model that we have become accustomed to. In the beginning, the papers were designed by and for the elite society, and they were often backed and published by political parties and who wrote biased content to support their views. They were based mostly on opinion instead of the objective journalistic model that we attempt to employ as good journalism, and they were too expensive for the common everyday guy to afford, and so had small circulation numbers that catered to members of specific groups. When the penny press hit the scene, this was the first real revolution in the paper business. Benjamin Day, with his New York Sun's catchphrase, "It shines for all," pretty much summed it up. He began printing news for the everyday guy on the street, and they were sold on the street for a penny or two. And he supplemented the cost of creating the papers by advertising revenue for the first time. So the papers didn't have to answer to these special interest political groups, but to companies with products and audience members. And these papers focused on news instead of opinion pieces, and the idea of journalistic objectivity was born out of this penny press mold, because in order to survive, they had to appeal to a lot of people and not alienate groups with opinion-laden articles for a select audience. So this higher circulation meant more advertisers, and more advertisers and audience members meant more revenue. So this setup was a success, and like I said, it's been a successful model for over 160 years, and is just kind of starting to falter with the age of the internet. So let's look at the wave of accessible information and how it affected democratic society. The penny press newspaper readership grew intensely. Literacy rates flourished. Foreigners used them to learn English, and then this information availability or democratization of current events was a vital component of the Industrial Revolution. There was extreme growth in this country, in industry, the economy, and in political participation. More people were moving to the cities to work for wages, which transformed the country from primarily a rural society to an urban society in a really short period of time. And these people in the cities acquired a news habit which helped them stay current with issues facing society. And this in turn benefited the market for products being sold through advertising. Informing everyone promoted a democratic market society. So we went from being a nation of self-sufficient families to an industrial market-based economy. So the penny press was the foundation of modern journalism in the first half of the 19th century. And the second half was marked by many innovations that resulted from the Pulitzer versus Hearst battle for newspapers in the 1880s and 1890s. Joseph Pulitzer owned the New York World, and his name is remembered because of the esteemed Pulitzer Prize, which is awarded once a year in 21 different categories, including public service and breaking news, explanatory reporting, local reporting, feature photography, investigative reporting, music, poetry. It all breaks down into categories that cover newspaper, online journalism, literature, and music. The prize was part of Pulitzer's will. He left money to Columbia University to start a school of journalism and establish the prize, and they have been giving them away since 1917. Pulitzer was an Austrian immigrant. He came to the U.S. when he was 17 years old to fight in the Civil War, and after the war he studied law and became a reporter, and he bought his first newspaper, the St. Louis Dispatch, and he pretty much ran the whole thing himself. In 1883, he bought the New York World, which was struggling to survive at the time, and after 3 years he had upped circulation from 15,000 to 250,000, which attracted advertisers. And after he owned the paper for 12 years, circulation had went up to 540,000 readers. Pulitzer was an innovator, and his innovations changed the appearance of the front page to draw readers in quickly, and this proved to be very successful. The front page was dramatic, it had multi-column photographs and big headlines, and he kept the biggest story above the fold. He invented a technique that's still in use for headlines, subject, and active verb. So instead of saying tragic accident or something vague like that, it would say factory worker killed. Pulitzer also demanded that articles were written like stories, so that they were more interesting instead of the dry language of previous papers. He targeted immigrants and women. He included women's pages and advertisements geared toward both groups, and people who didn't speak English yet appreciated all of the pictures that he would put in his publications to help them understand the stories and learn English. He also employed Nellie Bly, who was a stunt journalist, and she was a woman. One of her first big assignments that made her very famous is that she pretended to be insane and infiltrated an insane asylum and reported on how the patients were being treated. So Pulitzer was a pioneer of a lot of the techniques that are still used in newspaper journalism today. William Randolph Hearst was born to a wealthy family and began in the newspaper business as an editor at his father's newspaper at the San Francisco Examiner, and soon he challenged the reigning king of New York newspapers, Pulitzer, by purchasing the New York Journal. Hearst began using Pulitzer's techniques to compete for readers, and the competition became very fierce rivalry, with each paper just trying to top the other one and outdo the other with more and more sensational stories and headlines. So this competition was the rise of yellow journalism, which is sensationalistic stories that are designed to shock readers and draw them in. The name yellow journalism came from a comic that the two papers fought over for a period of time called The Yellow Kid. In the end of the battle that they fought, stealing the artist who did the Yellow Kid back and forth from each other, the two papers ended up running different versions of the same cartoon drawn by two different artists. This battle got really dicey when both papers were reporting on the Spanish-American War. Both Pulitzer and Hearst knew that war and pictures of war sold newspapers, and even though the conflict was pretty tame, the papers both printed pictures and sensational headlines about the conflict that made it seem much more dramatic than it actually was. We are all familiar with tabloids. We see next to the checkout stand at the grocery store, and their outlandish headlines about aliens and bat boys and celebrity sensationalism splashed all over the cover. The Star and the National Enquirer are weeklies. Then there are dailies like the Daily News and the Chicago Sun-Times, and their format is basically outlandish, sensational headlines with lots of interesting and sometimes doctored pictures, and they're just more entertainment than news. The style of reporting is known as jazz journalism, which is a little more dramatic than yellow journalism, and first became popular in the 1920s. Tabloid size is 11 by 14 inches, so larger than a magazine and smaller than a broadsheet newspaper. They have a cover instead of a front page, and there's usually no fold in a tabloid. One of the earliest tabloids was the New York Daily News, which is actually still in circulation today. Our tabloids don't even compare to the British tabloids, The Sun and Daily Mirror. They are notorious for being the most outlandish, cutthroat, anything to get a scoop papers in the world. I have a link here for News of the World, which is Rupert Murdoch's tabloid, and recently they were in trouble for hacking phone lines. And I have a video here that I will place in the folder of the trial with Rupert Murdoch. And what I thought was interesting is that we saw the beginning of the trial and all the hoopla surrounding it, but then after he was pied in the face, we never heard the outcome or anything else about it. And so I kind of wondered if maybe Rupert had a hand in orchestrating that event so that we would kind of forget his wrongdoing. He's a spin king. So if you would like, I'll put that video in the folder and you can check out Rupert getting pied in the face. News radio began to compete with newspapers in the 20s with up-to-the-minute broadcasting, starting with the Harding-Cox presidential election results. And the newspapers were upset that radio had revealed the results before their regular morning edition had the chance to break the news. The papers even began to argue that the radio should not be able to broadcast news, and they threatened to stop running listings for news broadcasts. It has happened time and time again where the old media tries to stifle the new media, usually without success, and then they learn to innovate and live with each other. So what makes news? What is news itself? What qualifies for these papers to print it? Well, there are a couple of things that outline what qualifies as news. Timeliness, is it happening now rather than it happened a while ago? Proximity, is it close to home? Can you relate? This proximity idea has become a much larger concept with the internet. We live in a more global community and have compassion for, say, people in Haiti as well as our neighbors, but we are still probably more concerned with what's happening in our own little worlds. Prominence. The people in the story are prominent, or you've heard of them before, or maybe they are a public figure or a movie star. Consequence. The bigger the consequences of the situation, the more newsworthy it is. So redoing the Golden Gate Bridge impacts more people than redoing the 6th Street Bridge in Rapid City. So the story about the Golden Gate Bridge is more newsworthy. Rarity, how odd and unique the event is. So the book gives an example of an albino tiger being born, and that's news because it's out of the ordinary. It's a unique situation. And then human interest. Just stories about people that touch your heart or interest us in some way, like the story of a child saving another child or a sibling, heroics, life, interesting parts of the human condition that are relatable. This is news. So in our current situation, newspapers are struggling quite a bit just to keep out of the red and actually turn a profit. So what is happening in this transition? Are they dying? Are they transforming into something new? Well, newspapers are trying to find a foothold in this transition to digital formats, and many are struggling and closing and downsizing and moving to online and starting with these new metered models like I think the New York Times and actually our Rapid City Journal just switched to, if you view a certain amount of articles online per month, they take a micro payment for, a certain amount of money or whatever it is. And the newspaper industry has just been hit very hard in this transition because they're kind of vertically integrated. So they do everything from creating content, designing the presentation, printing, distributing. So everywhere the internet has interfered with the print media industry, newspapers have taken a hit in some kind of way. So I guess the question is are newspapers dying, or are they just kind of transforming into something new? But we probably won't know for a while until the dust settles. Because now newspapers break news on websites, and they have mobile sites and podcasts and social media feeds. And people are still spending time with news, but they're going to more than one source to find that news out, which is a good thing as far as media literacy. Well, thanks for listening about newspapers, and have a great day. Bye. Here are your study guide questions for Chapter 6. Describe the idea of journalistic objectivity, and where did it begin? What significance did the penny press have, and how did they change the media business? What is news? Tell me the 6 things that make something newsworthy.